Support for this episode comes from Omnipod. I'm amazed how hard these automated insulin delivery systems work. Omnipod 5 automatically increases, decreases, or pauses insulin delivery every 5 minutes. This technology is called Smart Adjust, and it's in the pod. This means if you're out on the football field and the controller is in your bag, the pod and Dexcom G7 continue to talk and make adjustments. That would have been awesome for us in middle school when Benny played football, or when he was backstage at the school play. All that, and you get the freedom of no tubes. Fill out the quick online form, see if you're eligible for a free trial. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety risk information and free trial terms and conditions, visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, legal rights and diabetes have come a long way, but as the technology changes, so have some of the challenges. What can a parent do when a school refuses to use continuous glucose monitoring? I'm talking to two attorneys this week who have actionable advice and the law on their side. The Department of Justice has already ruled on this in one state in a decision that has nationwide impact. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. Always so glad to have you here. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. Before we jump in, if you're listening as this episode goes live, we have a webinar all about Diabetes Camp. That is Wednesday the 7th, and it is at noon. I'm doing that along with Anna Sabino from Finding Smiles Coaching. If you are listening to this episode in the future, drop me a line. We can probably get you the link to the recording. My son went to Diabetes Camp from ages 7 to 15, and Anna, who is a CDCES and has her own practice, she was a camper. She was camp staff. It's been a huge part of her diabetes journey. So the webinar, we're going to have a lot of fun. We're going to answer a lot of questions. There's a link in the show notes, or as I said, just drop me a line if you're listening after it happens. Okay, the issue of CGM share and follow in school is a big one, and it's a recent one. Longtime listeners and longtime people with diabetes know that CGM itself is relatively new. Share and follow capabilities have only been around for less than 10 years. I mean, maybe a little bit more than 10 years if you count DIY stuff. But, there was no way to follow my son. Benny went to school without a CGM. He was diagnosed at 2. He didn't get a CGM until he was 9. We didn't have share and follow for another 2 years. He was almost in middle school at that point. So I never had any school personnel looking at his numbers. And I think it's okay to admit, and you may notice as you listen to the interview, that fact makes me a little biased here. Sometimes I do think parents can overreact about school staff not following every second, right? Or not jumping on every single number. How judgy of me, right? How judgmental does that make me sound? But I think it's important to admit it because I think some of you feel that way as well. But what we're talking about this week is not helicopter parenting, and it is not unreasonable. These attorneys are getting involved because some schools are doing nothing, or they want the endocrinologist to follow the kids, or they won't allow CGM at all. Can you imagine a 6-year-old on a closed loop system and the school wants the parent to turn off the CGM for the day? Yeah, that's what we're talking about. My guests this week are two attorneys who are really passionate about this subject. Bonnie Roswig is with the Center for Children's Advocacy. This is a small nonprofit that focuses on addressing legal needs of vulnerable children. And Jonathan Chappell, he lives with type 1. He was diagnosed as an adult in 1999. He is a private practice lawyer in Connecticut. He's a past president of the local JDRF board there and a board member as well. I'm going to be talking to them about the legal ruling that came down in Connecticut, why this matters nationwide, and what parents can do if they're having issues right after this. The all-new Dexcom G7 continuous glucose monitoring system is now available. Powerful and simple, Dexcom G7 is proven to lower A1C and help you spend time in range, all without finger sticks, scanning, or calibrations. There are so many amazing new features to talk about, I'm never sure where to begin. Dexcom G7 is 60% smaller than the previous generation and is the most accurate CGM system out there. The 30-minute warm-up period is fantastic and up to 2 times faster than any other CGM brand. And I love the all-in-one sensor and transmitter. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Bonnie, Jonathan, thank you so much for talking to me about this issue. I really appreciate you spending some time with me and my listeners. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us today, Stacey. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about these important issues.
Yeah, let's jump in and explain first. And Bonnie, let me start with you. So what are we talking about? What's the problem here?
Certainly. So every child with any kind of healthcare condition has a right to participate fully in a school setting. And every school, in our view, in any event, is really required to comply with healthcare provider orders so that the child can be healthy and fully participate in school. I work with the endocrinology department at our local children's hospital. And over the years, I have gotten questions around different entities wanting to limit access to T1D kids. Oh, a new diagnosis can't go to camp. Oh, a new diagnosis can't go to daycare. We've worked on and resolved these issues over the years under what's called the Americans with Disabilities Act, which guarantees anyone with a health care condition equal access to equal to those without that disability. The issue around CGMs became, the issue used to be the obligations of these different entities to give insulin to children. With the development of technology, it's now around the schools complying with healthcare providers' orders around following CGMs. So we had this issue in Connecticut, I believe in 2019, 2020, where school systems in Connecticut were just flat out refusing to follow CGMs. We tried to educate them as to what the new technology was all about. We tried to educate them, this is Jonathan and I, around their obligation to comply with federal law, and they would not do it. So we filed complaints against 4 different school districts in Connecticut, stating that the schools were not following the mandates of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Happily, those cases were resolved, and those schools agreed to follow the continuous glucose monitor and pretty much have been doing so ever since. And Jonathan can fill in as to what happened post 2020 or post pandemic, I want to say.
Well, let's do that. So Jonathan, then if it's resolved, why are we still talking? What happened next?
We've asked that questions of ourselves several times. Why are we still talking about this? Why is the issue not resolved? And in our opinion, it should be, and it has been. I can't get into the mind of a school system not located in Connecticut as to what they're thinking as far as the precedential value of the CGM concerns or closeouts in Connecticut, but I don't believe the law has changed. And if anything, the device has evolved even further than it was when those issues were resolved. You find it runs the gamut of miseducation, not understanding what the Americans with Disabilities Act is. It's a federal law and it applies or should be applied throughout all of our territories and states, and they're not for whatever reason. One of the parents heavily involved in this started to not only recruit families to report what they were experiencing, but she got in touch with Bonnie at first, and Bonnie then got in touch with me, and we got the band back together, I guess.
Well, and let me just dial down a little bit. When we say the schools are not complying, what are they not doing? Are they not checking CGM? Are they not remote monitoring? What's the problem?
The problem is that the schools are not sufficiently following. Just to fill in a little bit of the rest of the story, our settlement agreements, we're good in Connecticut. We're in good shape. The problem is the rest of the country isn't following suit. And I think that the gap in between, 2020 when our decisions were issued and our settlement agreements were entered, And when T1D kids started to go back to school, which was really 2021, even some 2022, there was a shift. What we found in Connecticut, it was a fear of the unknown. And, as we all know, the technology is really so easy. So we've heard from parents in over 40 states. And generally speaking, again, it's our position and certainly the parents' position that the schools aren't complying with healthcare provider orders around what they're required to do. Some schools originally weren't allowing CGMs at all. Some schools are tasking the child themselves with following their own CGM. And we're talking about really little children, kindergartners, first graders, or they're having the child and the classroom teacher be responsible. And if you think about, a busy, noisy elementary school classroom, tasking the teacher with that doesn't seem particularly effective, and who's going to hear the alarm. Generally speaking, what the schools are not allowing is the nurse to follow it. And, the nurse sits in her nurse's office, can check an app. How long does it take, to look at the numbers on the app? So that is generally what is going on. In a lot of instances, the parents are tasked with the oversight. Some schools are suggesting that the healthcare provider be tasked with the oversight. It's just, as Jonathan said, it's very confusing as to what the barrier is, because seemingly the whole point of a CGM is to make this simple and painless, and equally important so that child's classroom experience isn't unnecessarily interrupted simply because they have a T1D diagnosis.
Okay. A little bit later on, I want to talk to you about my personal experience with my kid and play maybe a little devil's advocacy here. But Jonathan, let me ask you, are you looking for a uniform rule? Is there something in the ADA guidelines already that says, a school should allow the nurse to follow on school devices? Is there something uniform you're looking for, or is it already there and they're just not complying with it?
The way the ADA works, it's very difficult. Diabetes is not the only qualifying disability. And so it's very difficult, in my view, to amend the ADA or pass a regulation. What they really need to do, which is not just, again, diabetes, but for every disability, is they have to do an individualized assessment. And part of that will include talking and looking at medical information from the outside medical provider and what is in the orders. I mean, I think a lot of the cases, unfortunately, are very similar. For instance, we have encountered issues where school districts and even states have written policies that essentially say no CGM allowed, or not to be followed by or monitored by anyone, school staff, school nurse, etc. I mean, to me, that's a very simple issue. They say, no, we're not going to do it. And they reasonably cannot say that. Reasonable modification. I always, run the analogy. I have type 1 and I'm 47 years old and I'm still followed by my spouse and my daughter. They don't come to work with me or drive a car all the time with me. But if they get an urgent low or some alarm on their device, they might shoot me a text and say, what's going on? And a school can obviously do this. I know some schools are bigger than others, but to me, it's a lot easier to use this technology for what it is intended to do, which is to keep children safe at school. And it's not a huge burden at all, if any burden. If in fact used correctly, in my opinion, this takes off some of the burden on the school, because instead of glancing at our iPad and seeing that Samantha is right on range and everything is fine, they would have to go to the child or have the child come down to the nurse's office, follow universal precautions, and change lancets and do a finger stick and hopefully get an accurate reading and do something or nothing. And so certainly glancing at a piece of technology that, to be honest, we're all looking at all day, including right now during this, seems to be a much less of a burden in my view. And I should say my wife is a fourth grade elementary school teacher, and I get it. Additional work for school staff is something that they might be concerned about, but I don't believe this is additional work. Matter of fact, it's probably less work.
The Americans with Disabilities Act, as Jonathan says, the standard is reasonable accommodations to policies, practices, and procedures. So glancing at a CGM, it's hard to imagine that someone consider that not be reasonable. And the ADA, as Jonathan says, doesn't go diagnosis by diagnosis by diagnosis. But if you look at the decisions that the Justice Department has issued, the decisions and settlement agreements, again and again and again, oversight of T1D kids is considered to be a reasonable accommodation. In the event that somebody is worried about this, that is, for whatever reason, nervous that it's going to be too time consuming, it's too much effort. And, the decisions repeatedly say that that is not true, including manually giving insulin, then they are supposed to do what's called this individualized assessment. That is required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sit down with the parent, get input from the healthcare provider, saying, what do we need to do? Let's discuss our barrier and figure out how we can do this. Because the Americans with Disabilities Act globally starts with the initial question is, how can this child participate? Not, oh, it's too difficult, we're too nervous about the technology. It is about inclusion and equal participation.
So let's talk about action here. You have recently filed a complaint with the DOJ in Virginia. You say more to come, most likely. You have a petition, or there is a petition, I should say, about this. What are you asking families who are listening to do? Right back to the interview. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by EdgePark. Managing diabetes doesn't need to get in the way of your passion, your social life, or your budget. EdgePark can help you simplify your diabetes journey so you can focus on other important things. EdgePark offers a wide array of continuous glucose monitors, such as the Dexcom G7, Freestyle Libre 3, and more. Plus, EdgePark accepts most insurance plans and handles the paperwork. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the EdgePark logo to learn more.
Because there are so many stories and states, there's no way that Bonnie and I can get to every family that's impacted, unfortunately. We have filed, as you said, a formal complaint with the DOJ, an administrative complaint with the Eastern District of Virginia, District of Utah, and there will be more. We're strategically sort of looking at where and when filing should happen. But we've also assisted in putting together for families we can't get in touch with or who want to file on their own, which is fine, what we're calling a template complaint. And I think that any family impacted by this in some way should look at that template complaint and may obviously download it and use it with their local office. We are obviously available if someone wants to reach out with questions, but we put together a complaint that hopefully is able to be downloaded and put together by a family who wants to go at it on their own, which is fine.
The parents that are contacting us are so extraordinarily worried about their children's safety. And it's so unnecessary. Again, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the legal standard, it is never the responsibility of the parent to provide the medical oversight to their child in a school setting or in most settings. And that's not only true of diabetes, that's true of any healthcare condition. But in this context, you have parents who are watching because they are feeling that the school isn't doing it appropriately. They are noticing multiple times when children are going usually extraordinarily low, but periodically extraordinarily high. And no one is noticing and no one is catching. So the more the oversight is not there, the more concerned the parents get. I guess our message, again, it's our position. We are not the Justice Department. We don't make those ultimate decisions. But in our view, they should be bringing this to someone's attention because their children deserve to participate fully in a school setting. And there are rights of parents as well under the Americans with Disabilities Act, rights that attach to the parent because of the child's disability. And they also have the right to be free from having to do the oversight and be assured that their child will be safe.
So as we're talking about all of this and understanding, as I know you do, that every school district and every state has, different staffing issues. I live in North Carolina, where we do not have full-time school nurses. It's a funding issue. It's ridiculous, but it's the way that it has been. We moved here, we moved here 25 years ago. It's been like this forever. It's not ideal, but we have been fortunate to have it work for us. My son went to kindergarten with, no CGM because it was years and years ago, and he didn't get a CGM until he was 9, and we didn't have remote monitoring for probably 2 more years because it wasn't available. So all of that to say, what are you looking for or asking for in states that do not have full-time nurses? I mean, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened when I sent Benny to school with a CGM and said, well, the law says the nurse has to follow. And they said, well, what about Tuesdays and Thursdays when the nurse isn't here?
I think the answer is it's someone's job to follow. That same child, there had to be some resolution pre-CGMs for your child.
Well, sure, we always had, and there were always staff members. To be clear, it is law. I mean, it is the regulation that there has to be a staff member. I mean, in North Carolina, you can even designate someone to administer insulin at school. It doesn't have to be a healthcare professional. It just has to be somebody who is trained. So I should have been more clear, especially for the listener. There was always somebody who was in charge of helping him. It just wasn't a healthcare professional, if that makes sense.
Correct. Someone trained in the context of not a school setting, particularly in Connecticut, same thing as you're describing. It does not have to be a nurse. There have been decisions that have said it doesn't have to be a nurse, but it has to be someone who has the time and the expertise to do the appropriate oversight, that it shouldn't be the child's task. It shouldn't be the parent's task. There should be someone somewhere who is appropriately trained and designated to follow the CGM at the times of the day designated by the healthcare professional or who's available to respond to alarms.
If I could just add too, I would say Bonnie, because she does this full time, is probably less curt and more professional in her responses at times. But let me give you an example. The obligation for the school to monitor blood glucose is clear. Back for years, we're not even talking about CGM in this. That's clear. What is also clear is it's a school's obligation, not a family's or the child, especially if you're talking about, which we are in some cases, an autistic child or cognitively delayed child who happens to also have type 1 diabetes. There are many persons under the school's umbrella which are not licensed as nurses. Even in Connecticut, we have schools without a nurse or with a part-time nurse or with one nurse for several hundred or more kids. The idea is somebody has to be trained, and that person does not have to be licensed as a nurse, physician, or otherwise. To me, it should not matter. Your state legislation dictates or does not dictate that a nurse has to be there or not be there. That does not remove a school's federal obligation under the ADA, in our opinion. So the answer is, if you want to go back to finger sticks, then glancing at an iPhone, again, seems to be a lot less of a burden, requires a lot less training, perhaps. You can have a child where they go low, you glance and you catch it early and they drink some juice and crisis averted, literally. I still get back to, I don't understand why we're fighting about CGM monitoring of glucose, because in the old days, meaning, I don't know, less than 10 years ago even, CGM were not the standard of care, and now they are. Their education needs to evolve as well as the technology, which will reduce the burden once there isn't this barrier.
Bonnie, let me ask you, what would you recommend a parent do if there is an issue like this in their school today, right? We're a ways off of anything that we're talking about today kind of going through, or these challenges state by state happening. But if a family is really struggling with making their school understand that this is something that they need, what should they do?
It's a great question. Many parents have gone through an entire laundry list of, trying to access appropriate protections for their children. But, we always encourage communication. Say we're talking about a child with a new diagnosis and a parent and a new prescription for a CGM. One of the things that it's really important is to get support of the healthcare provider, for the healthcare provider to write out specifically what needs to happen for the child in terms of CGM monitoring, what time of day, what the settings on the CGM should be, depending on the child's particulars, as much as anybody can predict that. I would advise parents to communicate with the administration of the school, communicate with the school nurse, make sure that the school nurse is connecting with whatever endocrinology provider that the parent is using, so that there can be very clear communication around what the child's needs are, what the parent's expectations are, and at the end of the day, how to keep this child safe and how to maximize the child's participation in school activities.
Yeah, I think getting your doctor involved is the greatest thing. I mean, the words "my doctor says" has always opened doors for us. Even in situations where they weren't taking me seriously, I could always say, "Oh, our doctor says." And it was amazing how suddenly now I was believable.
And I think that that's, such an important voice in all of this. We get a lot of, the parents want us to monitor it 24/7. None of my parents of the parents that Jonathan and I have spoke to have asked that. What they've said was, I want to know what you're doing to keep my child safe. And, it's important for the parent to have a conversation with endocrinology as to, based on their experience, what needs to happen. Of course, parents are worried. All of us as parents are going to be concerned. What is of concern to us is that in the current posture, some schools are saying, some endocrinology departments are saying, well, the schools have contacted us and told us not to include monitoring CGMs in the child's healthcare plan. So the doctor isn't including it. And that is really concerning, because that's what keeps the child safe. I think perhaps it puts the doctors or the healthcare providers in between a rock and a hard place, but it is very concerning because the schools have to respect that the endocrinologist department is the expert. It's true that they are the school and they deal with the child daily, but medical decisions need to yield to the experts. And that is really the bottom line.
And just to be clear, I mentioned kind of devil's advocate early. So I'm trying to feel out how to ask this question. So I'll do it with a story, which is how I usually like to ask questions. When my son was in elementary school, he was the only kid there for kindergarten that had type 1. But by the end of first grade, there were 4 kids total. And it was interesting because they all managed in slightly different ways. So, we're talking, I don't know, how old is my son? 19. So we're talking, almost 15 years ago. No, almost 15 years ago. So we're talking a long time ago. Everybody was on finger sticks. Nobody had a CGM. Certainly nobody had remote monitoring. But as those kids got older, they all adopted different bits of technology. And the school wound up following some of them. The nurse who was there part-time would follow some. My son never shared his numbers with anybody in the school setting all the way through. He's in college now. He decided, as a family, we decided he would never do any remote monitoring for any school personnel, but other kids did. Sometimes we hear about lawsuits and writings and rules like this, and the concern from a minority of parents, but parents like me, who didn't ever want remote monitoring, is like, oh my gosh, am I going to be forced to do this? Just to be completely clear, this is all about letting the parents choose what's best for their kids, right?
The parent is certainly a part of that process. I mean, I was a multiple daily injection patient when I was first diagnosed, and pumps were they were available, but certainly not as available as they are today. For that time, I was a multiple daily injection patient, and I know some children, even whether it's because their parents have a reason, and obviously the parent and the doctor outside the school speak, and they come up with an appropriate medical plan that the family is comfortable with. And so obviously, we're not saying in any way that if there is a child that doesn't want anything to do with CGM, that the school force them to use CGM. That would be preposterous. What we're saying is there needs to be an individualized assessment. And case in point, in your example, you had 4 or 5 different families with slightly different plans. The school has to adjust to that plan and its obligation to provide accommodations or modifications that are needed for each particular child, not just we're doing this and that's all we do. And if you don't like it, go somewhere else. That is not appropriate. We are also not looking to force CGM on patients and families who have no interest for whatever the reason. But we're saying if a healthcare plan is in place that a child is to use CGM, then the school has to reasonably accommodate that request.
Bonnie, let me, as we start kind of wrapping up here, let me ask you, any success stories have come out of this? I mean, maybe it's your families in Connecticut or others that have maybe contacted you around the country. I'd love it if you could share a success story where a school kind of saw the light.
This all started because Connecticut was the success story. We had 4 different school districts around the state, very different sort of economic pictures in those different cities. And we had very successful results. They all agreed to follow CGM. I think a lot of it was just that nursing staff or whoever staff in the schools were just uncomfortable with the new technology. And I mean, what we find is that in any kind of accommodation relative to a disability, it is the parade of the horribles. How do we do this? We don't know, we're uncomfortable with diabetes. Well, it's just then be educated. It is not such a burden that you're educated as to diabetes care. My parents at the pediatric facility that I work at, they take care of their children. They are not doctors. They are not nurses, and they learn how to do it, and they do it successfully. And I check in with our endocrinology department and I say, what are you hearing from the schools? What are you hearing from the nurses? Because nationally, we are hearing some very concerning stories. Their response is, everything's fine. We don't get any pushback at all around following CGMs. Now, again, those are the nurses in the schools that they deal with in Connecticut, but it is striking that it's just a comfort level. I think for the rest of the country, I think parents have learned that there is a road to try and get some support, that they're only following their best efforts to try and keep their children safe, that it is an appropriate ask. Interestingly, no one would deny if the parent said, never mind CGM, I want my child to go to the nurse's office 4 times a day for the finger stick.
Right. Yeah.
So the fact that parents want to keep their child safe, want to use a technology that doesn't involve pain, that doesn't involve removal from education, that's a reasonable thing for them to want for their child. We trying to work towards sort of more global solutions so that school districts nationally get some appropriate guidance on this. So that's a direction that we're trying to go to. But in the meantime, just letting parents know that they do have rights, their children have rights, and it's all right to be concerned about how they're being treated. And in terms of results, all our parents can do is try to protect their children in any way that they feel comfortable doing.
There are federal rights, and I struggle with compromising those rights. But there are scenarios where I'm sure, and I know, that families have gotten a hard no, we don't do any of that. And they've been able to work it out with the school. And sometimes parents compromise on things like, they might buy a device instead of requiring the school to give it to them. just to get this done. It's not right, but it's completely understandable. But that's when you get pretty close to comfort that your child will be safe at school. And I can understand that maybe you blink on certain things that you can live with. But this is a very simple issue to me. As a type 1 and knowing enough about this law or area of the law and handled a similar complaint before, there's one federal ADA. There's not an ADA in each of our states. And so if it's been done somewhere else, whether you like Connecticut or not, it's federal law. And they would have told us to go away at that point if there wasn't an issue. So I believe that parents should be doing what they're doing, recruiting more members impacted by this issue, using the template, or reaching out. That's all.
Great.
We just really appreciate your interest in hearing the story and the issue. It is concerning as to how many families and children that this is affecting.
Well, we will link up all of the information if people want to get involved or learn more. Bonnie Roswig, Jonathan Chappell, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this issue. And we will, I'm sure, speak again. Hopefully it'll be resolved, but we'll see how it goes. And I'll check back in with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us today.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacy Sims.
There's a lot more on this. There are forms that you can fill out if you'd like to get more involved. You can also look at some of the legal rulings and the legal writings. I will link up as much as I possibly can in the show notes for you, but reach out, please, if you have any questions. I do want to say I asked them, not when we were recording, about whether they had reached out to the CGM companies, to Dexcom, to Libre, and especially Dexcom, which is what most kids wear, especially kids with closed loops. And, they were very diplomatic. I'm not going to put words in their mouths here, especially because it was, I won't say off the record, but I don't have their words here. Basically, what they said was, maybe we don't have the right people. They did reach out. They have not gotten an answer. So if you're listening from Dexcom, and I am talking to a Dexcom soon, I'm happy to pass this along. Maybe we can get them the right person. Before I let you go, Mom's Night Out Charlotte happened this past weekend. This event is just knocking my socks off every time we do it. Actually, I have to be honest with you. Every time we do it, I say, why did I do this? Why did I decide to get into the event business? This is a huge mistake. This is not going to be fun. No one's going to come, even though all these people have paid and registered. And so far, they've all been amazing. And so I'm sure I'm taping this before the event, obviously, but I'm sure that I'm going to love it, just like I have the first 3. This is our 4th. And as you listen, we are either this close or we have opened Chicago. So go check out diabetes-connections.com and click on the Mom's Night Out tab. Check out our upcoming cities and let me know where you'd like us to go next. All right, thank you as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacy Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacy Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.
Most people who take insulin have experienced low blood sugar. It can be disorienting and scary. Very low blood sugar is very scary. And that's where Jylk HypoPen comes in. Jylk HypoPen is a ready-to-use rescue pen for treating very low blood sugar in people with diabetes ages 2 and above. If you take insulin or sulfonylurias, you are at risk for your blood sugar going too low. Low blood sugar emergencies can happen unexpectedly, and they demand quick action. You need a safety net when it matters most. Be ready to treat very low blood sugar with Jylk HypoPen. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Jylk logo. Jylk shouldn't be used if you have a tumor in the gland on top of your kidneys called pheochromocytoma, or if you have a tumor in your pancreas called insulinoma. Visit jylkglucagon.com/risk for safety information.